building Brand Bharat, India's next decade. We made a conscious shift in moving from India to Bharat.
What we think of ourselves is very different often from what others think of you.
We have become very attractive to global bond investors. So in fact, the investors pressured the index providers that India should be included. And so to hell with the rating agencies.
50% of India's foreign direct investment since 1947 came in the last 5 years.
We have to have the confidence in all these other dimensions, and that is part of building Brand Bharat. Thank you very much. My gratitude to the India Foundation for including me amongst the illustrious speakers at the session. It's my first time. Many of you know of the link between Donald Trump and the World Wrestling Federation. I feel a little bit as though that's what we are. And in particular, I don't appreciate having my back to a sizable part of the audience, but c'est la vie. So I guess the immediacy of the set. So let me compliment you. I think my co-panelists, I'm really the chair, have already been introduced, but it's a great pleasure to be with them because they are both people I've known for a long time, and both contribute significantly to public discourse. I want to start though by complimenting WF and the India Foundation for choosing a theme or a title which is suitably ambiguous. Building Brand Bharat, India's next decade. And that can take the discussion in a number of directions. I'm just going to kick off with some of the thoughts. I have to say that much of what I was wanting to say was scooped by Honorable FM and her very deep presentation, but nonetheless, I'll press on. And then my colleagues have asked for about 10 minutes each to give their perspective. There's no right or wrong about this, but and then I'll try and moderate a discussion and leave time for questions and answers. So I think a place to start is deconstructing building Brand Bharat. And a question that arises, who is to do the building? Okay, so is this the society as a whole? Is this a more specialized communications kind of task? I say this because, frankly, when I worked for Shell in the Netherlands, the relentlessness of the Dutch brand, tulips and windmills, etc., it was in your face all the time. So people spend a lot of money and effort in defining a national brand. I mean, so is that what we're talking about? I don't think so. But I then go to the word brand. I think Honorable Finance Minister had in mind that brands are really for the rest of the world. Incredible India, God's own country, etc. But, being privileged to listen, to see Honorable PM in many settings, he actually, I think, thinks that this brand is to be defined not only by Indians, but by Indian youth. So are we seeking values and a brand that resonate with India and Indians themselves? And if so, in what context? And I would say that brands are partly about values, and certainly, and this has come up already in what FM had to say about Tolstoy, I mean, I think he is very focused on the importance of self-confidence as part of the India brand today, the next decade, and through Viksit Bharat. And that then leads to the question in my mind of what are or how has the perception of the Indian brand evolved and where is it now? So I think spirituality has always been a part of the Indian brand, but I think that was to some extent associated with unassertiveness. And I think that what has happened over the last decade with India's achievements, with India's demographic outcome, is that people are seeing a different side of India. Assertive, but I hope not threatening. And so I think thinking about what the core values are that we want to capture in the brand, this is slightly abstract, but that's what I was moved to think about by the title. And then we made a conscious shift, and we understand why, in moving from India to Bharat. I think that was most visibly advertised at the time of the G20, although there were elements of it before. And so I don't think that needs a lot of explication domestically, but we should recognize that what was talked about both by FM and by the previous speaker, that these are, as it were, attributes that are not necessarily associated with, are not necessary, they don't have immediate associations in people's minds. So my questions then to my fellow panelists is that is building the India brand a process? What should be the elements of that process? Those of you in particular, how is the India brand seen at the moment? And how self-conscious do we need to be about building the brand? So let me give you the word first, Neelkanth, and I'll keep you to about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Suman, and thank you, India Foundation, WMG, to invite me to speak at this August forum. India is many things to many people. We can, I think, divide it, and you put it very wonderfully, into what India or Bharat is to the world outside, and what is it to Indians, because Indians are a sixth of humanity, so it does matter what Indians think of themselves. For the world outside, again, there is significant diversity. So the way an Indian or a multinational CEO would think in say the US or in the Bay Area would be very different from the common man on the streets of Europe and how they would perceive of India, or say a Chinese would see India, and there would be significant diversity. And I think the framing of the question towards the end that you had of, is there something deliberate about it, or are brands built, especially country brands, built automatically? And I think so far, whatever has happened has been, I would say, endogenous, or it has just happened. No one has designed it or wanted it to happen in a certain way. And we have built a very good and strong brand in certain areas. So, for example, take IT. You go anywhere in the world and you want to find an IT solution, and we are sitting right in the middle of Bangalore, and India comes up. I mean, it comes up for and it has evolved. It has gone from just doing Y2K to some doing high-tech stuff. But if you want good quality solutions at scale, you go to India. If you are a buyer of pharmaceuticals in the US, the fact that nearly half by volume of all drugs are sold in the US are manufactured in India is very well known. The FDA has large offices in India to supervise Indian factories. There is an element of trust. So it's not just about our ability to manufacture drugs or to write high levels of code. It is also about trust. No one is afraid to share IP with India. So, people have increasingly become cautious about and, separating their networks from their China offices. The venture capitalists don't share their data on their prospects with the Chinese counterparts, the same partners. In India, we are seeing, an acceleration in the setup of global capability centers, the cutting edge of car design, cutting edge of chip design. All of that is starting to happen in India, and that means that there is a very deep level of trust. Now, I don't know how much of that comes from the fact that many Indians are CEOs in the US, but this has all happened, and so the brand of India already stands for these things. But it has all come from consistent performance, meaning that starting from just doing bare grunt work and changing the 2-digit year number to the 4-digit year number to it has come from consistent delivery, consistent innovation in processes. And the best example of that is what has happened to our inclusion in the global bond indices. So we kept for a while, at least economists like me, I'm aware, policymakers, almost pleading to the rating agencies that, we need a rating upgrade. And the rating upgrade was required so that global flows could happen and our cost of capital comes down. But the rating upgrade never came. However, we are now part of the global bond indices and we are starting to get, so the rating agencies are behind the curve, and this has happened because through focus on macroeconomic stability, we have become very attractive to global bond investors. So in fact, the investors pressured the index providers that India should be included, and so to hell with the rating agencies. And that's what I think are core to the brand of a country. So Brand Bharat, I think standing for prudence, standing for long-term planning, long-term execution, stability. And I think that the respect with which the financial markets are now treating India has all come from relentless pursuit of stability and self-discipline. But as we think about the next 10 years, next 20 years, next 30 years,
we're enjoined to think about the next decade.
Yes.
Okay, so next decade.
Next decade. The brands are never constant. Brands keep changing. There's a changing context. Samsung started as a grocery trader. It is now the most cutting edge semiconductor manufacturer in the world, along with TSMC. So companies change, countries change. The context in which we operate today is very different from the context in which we operated 30 years back. And as we think about the brand for outsiders, we need to bring in new characteristics into it. We need to be seen as innovative. We need to be seen as people who can develop products. So it's not just that 1/5 of all chip design engineers are based in India. It is that how many chips are being designed, how many chip design companies are now India based. And I think that transition is absolutely critical if we have to not get stuck in the middle income trap. I think it's also important that we widen the reach of the brand. So from just being aware, having the CEOs aware that 1,000 or 20,000 or 50,000 of their workers are in India, to the average citizen engaging with Indian brands, Indian products, and becoming familiar with the quality that India stands for. Because I think that in the next 20 years, there is a significant opportunity in Indian workers working abroad. So as much as it is about global capability centers being set up in India, which required proof of no lack of IP theft, stable delivery, even during COVID, things were working, that consistency of performance. But as we think about 20-25% of our incremental workers every year becoming plumbers in Germany, nurses in the UK, farmers in Italy, it becomes very important that the average citizen in these countries starts to think favorably about India, sees us as rule followers, sees us as good people, sees us as people that they would like to work with. And that's where I think our brand extensions, I think, need to happen.
Could I use that as a jump-off point? So Neelkanth has set you up, Manish, in talking about jobs and workers. I have to say that the kind of picture that he paints is not the kind of picture that you would, or is not the kind of narrative that you pick up in the FT or you pick up in the New York Times, which is, massive unemployment and insufficient jobs, etc. You do this stuff for a living. So first, if you could begin with what code, which is really what is the nature of the jobs challenge as a part of the image of India. And then there are certain other points that Neelkanth made that I'd like to engage you on.
Yeah. So I think obviously brands in my mind are for companies and products are very different for cities and countries. Bangalore has a better brand than Bombay or Delhi, obviously, globally, I would say that. But obviously, I think what we think of ourselves is very different often from what others think of you. And I think for me, the first gap between what we thought of ourselves and what others thought of us was really when I landed in the US in August '94 for my MBA. There was a front page article on the Wall Street Journal which said that India is more interesting than important. I hope that journalist is eating the newspaper on which she wrote that, because 2 weeks ago I was in Minneapolis and there was this Midwestern white lady, nice lady, checking me in, and she was having trouble with the computer system, and she said, "Why don't you Indians send more software programmers and fix our computer systems?" Now, that would fry most economists' brains that a country with $2,500 per capita income would export more software than Saudi Arabia did oil in 2021. You wouldn't think of a labor market which had 5 million people writing software and getting $250 billion. So I think the notion of every American eating 5 tablets made in India, there are 200 billion generic tablets consumed by Americans every year, which means the average American has 5 made in India medicines. We may not make in India machines, we may not make textiles, but we do give 5 medicines to every American. So I think looking forward, and I'll come to the labor market question because I have that framed in my brand, I think we need 3 things in the India brand. We need to be strong, we need to be democratic, and we need to be modern. We haven't been always all these 3 things, right? We need to be strong. Ramdhari Singh Dinkar, my favorite poet, whom I always quote, says, "Shama shobhti us bhujang ko jiske paas garal ho." Only the strong can be kind, benevolent, and generous. So I think we need to be strong. I think we need to be democratic. I think Pakistan and India, born on the same night, have had different destinies because 3 million people win an election, 21 million people stand for an election. Iqbal, who is the national poet of Pakistan, used to say, "Jamhuriyat ek tarz-e hukumat hai, jisme logon ko gina jata hai, tola nahi." He was lamenting that people are counted, not weighed. And that may explain Pakistan's, sort of instinct to weigh people rather than count them. But I think we have a strong democratic brand. But there are other people here who can talk more about strength, soft power and hard power. There are other people more capable of talking about democracy. But I'd like to spend my time on modernity, because that's an important part and the third leg that I think has to be for the India brand. I think we need a modern economy. Fundamentally, we need to be more urbanized, more financialized, more formalized, more industrialized, and better human capital. I mean, finally, there's no such thing as poor people. They are people in poor places. Which state you live in, which city you live in, which sector you work for, which company you work for, and which skill you have really decides your prosperity in India. We've done mass democracy. We didn't do mass prosperity. And I think that was because we didn't have a modern economy. I think we need a modern society, which is meritocracy. IPL has made cricket more meritocratic, which Ranji Trophy didn't do. Streaming platforms have made movies more meritocratic, which Bollywood didn't do. I think private equity has made business more meritocratic, which the traditional licensed Raj didn't do. So I think a society which is modern obviously has the meritocracy angle. So the infrastructure of opportunity, which is what someone referred to, is the infrastructure of opportunity of the 3 E's of education, employment, and employability, which I'm covering in society, not in the economy, because I think India doesn't have a jobs problem, we have a wages problem, and that will come by improving productivity. But in a society, this question of infrastructure of opportunity is a little bit on a dent on the India brand. I think in politics, we need to have modernity too, right? We need to be good ancestors. And I think Neelkanth knows this more than I, that, sort of being a good ancestor, a modern state, as the FM also mentioned, is a welfare state. We are not going to have Ronald Reagan and Thatcher kind of modern markets, but we do need competitive markets, but we also need to think of the welfare state. The question is, do you finance the welfare state with taxes, or do you finance it with debt? And I think we have to finance our welfare state with taxes rather than debt. So that I think the long-term thinking, I grew up in Kashmir, they distinguish between amanat and jagir, and I think we have to think of it as amanat, which has to be handed over to the next generation, rather than jagir with what you can do what the hell you want with it. You can steal from your children or grandchildren, like many state governments are doing right now. But I think the fiscal prudence that we demonstrated through COVID and in a world where there are no fiscal conservatives left, the one thing you do here a little bit is that India has been fiscally prudent, and I think that's an important part of modernity. I mean, the quick ones on business, obviously we have to be modern business. When the licensed Raj ended in 1991, many people told me that India will become like the Wimbledon. It's played in England, but no Britisher ever wins. So multinationals will take over India. In my mind, multinationals are the new PSUs, and maybe that's giving PSUs a bad name. From my perspective, Indian entrepreneurs have finally learned to distinguish between our shareholder role, our board member role, and our chief executive role. And that's really unleashing Indian companies in ways that you couldn't do in the past. So in sort of thinking about the India brand, my favorite book about China is a book called Wealth and Power by Orville and Shell, where he says the 15 most important thinkers in the last 500 years have focused on wealth and power. If you wrote that book about India, you wouldn't title it Wealth and Power. Now, what would you title it is really interesting. Would you title it balance? Would you title it patience? Would you title it tolerance? Would you title it teamwork? I don't know. But I think in my mind, the two challenges with the India brand, which we do need to address as we think about Bharat, is really execution and is really thinking about teamwork. I think, the private sector has a trust deficit, the government has an execution deficit, non-profits have a scale deficit. So if we don't, India is poor because all three of us have our own swim lanes, but we haven't learned to work together in ways that we should have. And the other is execution. We do tend to get a reputation of talking more than we do. This is changing in the last 5, 10, 15 years. But, my dad wore a uniform, and one plaque he always carried was a quote by Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War. He said, any army that has too much of a gap between its thinkers and doers will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. Right? I think we have to recognize that to reduce that gap between thinking and doing is probably the last mile of the India brand. I think we're getting a brand for being democratic. We are getting a brand for being strong now. We do have to get a brand for being modern, and that really depends on transforming the economy away from 45% of our people working on farms. The answer to Suman's question on why people are worried about jobs is, of course, the stock of jobs since 1947 is a problem, but the flow of jobs since 1991 is a problem. China has moved 300 million people in the same period from farm to non-farm employment. So I think if we want to be a modern economy, if we want to be a modern country, which I think we do, democracy, modernism, and strength will be the three pillars of the brand.
Okay, but do you have a view, and I want to pick up on some of the points, do you have a view on whether the concept of a brand is useful, and is it useful to align, as it were, an agenda for the next decade? So where does building Brand Bharat, where does the brand element enter into it?
Brands
make America great again. Okay, right. So it's not a brand, it's a slogan, but yeah. So I just wanted to know, are we doing this for the rest of the world, or are we doing this for ourselves?
I think we're doing it for both. I think confidence is the biggest thing in Indians that has changed over the last 10 years. But I do think we have to sell ourselves. There are 211 members of the United Nations. Obviously, 50% of India's foreign direct investment since 1947 came in the last 5 years. But we do need a lot more capital. We do need a lot more technology. We do need a lot more engagement, in addition to becoming stronger ourselves. So I think brands are heuristics. Every chief executive is a chief revenue officer, you're a chief sales officer. Because branding and marketing and sales are really important for any organization. So I do think we obviously have to get stronger ourselves, but the world has to recognize our inner strength. So I think there is a value in sort of spending some time on thinking. If your marketing is 5 steps ahead of your product, then you have a problem. Your marketing can be 2 steps ahead of your product, or 1 step, and you can sort of fit into it. So my sense is, yes, I think that is a worthwhile project to think about identity, brands, and I think modernity, democracy, and are powerful inherently in India that we don't have to work on.
And I'll just add to that, and I think the point Manish makes is very important, that look at semiconductors. So 2 years back, when we had this 50% capex subsidy for fabs, I'm part of this committee that has to see the proposals, they made me cry. That here we are giving 50% capex subsidy to any company that has a decent plan. On top of that, state governments are giving 20, 25, some are now giving 30%. And this is the quality of proposals that we get. Today, courtesy the hard work done by the India Semiconductor Mission, the minister, the bureaucrats, we had a semiconductor executive summit on 10th of September. 100 CXOs from the leading global semiconductor companies, equipment companies, manufacturers, materials companies, design companies. They were all in one room, and they all looked at each other and said, forget what the people are saying, I am in the right place. And I think that's where branding helps. That this ecosystem creation would not have been possible if we had just kept lamenting the fact that we have no footprint in semiconductors. To actually put money to work, focus. In fact, some of the people at ISM, the India Semiconductor Mission, I think understand the org structures of global semiconductor majors better than the people in those organizations themselves. There's a lot of hard work that has gone in, that this time is different, we mean business. And once you build that brand, you see the value.
Okay, let me start with some of the positives and then turn to some of the work to be done. So you raised, and this will be at the level of abstraction, you raised 2 values, quality and trust, okay? And I would add to that consistency.
Yes.
I think all of us traveled to Singapore, and I was there earlier this year, and I asked the EDB, the Economic Development Board, which has been a, a, a power behind Singapore. So, how do you sell Singapore? And they said, we don't sell ourselves as very innovative or whatever, but we deliver on our promises, okay? So let me go to all three of those, because Manish talked about execution. So Manish, let me start perhaps with quality. Why is it that in certain spheres, IT, we've been able to, maybe even, medicine, establish a reputation for quality, but in certain parts of manufacturing, we haven't? What is the quality mindset? And how is it that Japan went, do you think, from being, associated with shoddy products in the 50s to made in Japan being? Any reflections on this, and what does it mean for the next decade?
Neelkanth was just talking about this, so maybe you can start.
So I think what happened in IT, because we were, it was a heads and hands business, and there were no other places where you could get so many heads and hands, and we had some visionary leaders, many of them from Bangalore, who managed to convert the raw material churned out by engineering institutes using process technology and deliver, right? So CMM level 5, 5I, whatever. And unfortunately, on the manufacturing side, the best practices are so far away, because the software was developing, growing at that time. And software services was a very new development. See, PCs didn't exist pretty much at scale till the late 90s, till the late 80s. But when you are getting into, say, shoe manufacturing, Nike sells 500 million shoes. The Indian shoe manufacturers, work with 5 lines, 10 lines, 20 lines. When a Chinese shoe manufacturer comes in, it is 200 lines. You start doing a production-linked incentive scheme. You know why the shoe PLI failed? It was because the industry said, in plain simple Hindi, kaddu katega, sab mein batega, right? That everyone will get 20 crores. No one wants to buy that. You have to give 5 people 200 crores if you meet a certain target. And we missed on that. But anyway, thankfully, like Tamil Nadu has now 5 of the top 10 shoe manufacturers in the world, non-Indian, being given 100, 200 acres of land, 6 to 8 hours of connectivity from the port, and they are coming in. The moment they come in, they bring in expertise, they bring in value chains, they bring in, again, trust that India can deliver. And I think on the manufacturing side, that's where we have slipped. The sooner we can correct for that, I think the better it will be for our growth, because clearly it is still sporadic. It is only TN which has solved that. I think UP needs to solve that.
If I can add to software, it's the most real-time people supply chain there is. We had 4 lakh engineers in 2000. At the peak in 2013, we went to 19 lakhs. Then there was a slowdown. We went back to 11 lakhs. Now we're back up to 15 lakhs. There are very few people supply chains in India that are so real-time. We produce more engineers than China and the US, and you can say, oh, an Indian engineer is not the same. It doesn't matter. For you, the software industry only needs 2.5 or 4 lakhs out of those 13 lakhs, so they get to pick one. They have to only kiss 4 frogs to find one princess. But manufacturing, I would submit, the 40 factory refugees, or maybe there are 50 of them now, who are now looking to leave China, they think infrastructure, skills, and finance are a thorn in the flesh. They're no longer a dagger in the heart. It used to be a dagger in the heart, infrastructure, and as he's saying, it's much better. I think skills, you've been able to staff up in electronic manufacturing because you need repair. And we were dancing with this ghost, oh, to make an iPhone, you need 1 year of training. You actually need only 8 weeks of training to start making an iPhone, so that's repair is happening. But the biggest problem with manufacturing, at least in my mind that I hear, is still the regulatory cholesterol. That is the one consistent brand issue we have, where global boards dance with this ghost that, oh, India is a really difficult place to do business, there's retrospective taxation, that there's 700 ways to go to jail in the Factories Act. Some of this is true, some of this is not true. So I think
so what does that mean for branding? I mean, how do we change that perception? You can't change the perception without changing something. Yes. What do we need to change that perception?
We need to cut the regulatory cholesterol, and now 75% of it is in states. There's 25% still left at the center, which we should set because that should become a demonstration. But 29 chief ministers clearly matter more than one prime minister. When people are choosing electronic manufacturing destinations, as currently many of them are, they're not choosing India, they've already decided. They're choosing Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Karnataka, or a state. So I think increasingly, we will, just like software, Bangalore may have a better brand in software than many other places. I think for manufacturing, Tamil Nadu right now has an unbeatable brand. I mean, every factory refugee I know is looking at Tamil Nadu, while Maharashtra has lost some of the sheep.
Do you agree with that? I mean, we're here to discuss the India brand. Is it the aggregate of individual state brands, or I can see that states can spoil our brand, but where do you go with Manish's comment that, look,
so on both
there's so much diversity? And look, by the way, as somebody who was working in Europe last decade, as I move around India, I think of each state as basically a country in the EU. Okay, so if you were to ask me how do you build the EU's brand, I would say forget about it. And yet that's the aggregate that we're talking about right now. But please continue.
No, but there is an India level problem as well. I mean, so to add to what Manish was saying, and now it's been, a lot of water has flowed under the bridge, so I think it's okay to talk about it. Like one of the biggest semiconductor manufacturers, at a time when we are struggling to get decent proposals, in October 2022 says, I want to spend $3 billion on a capex and give us half of that. We are amazed that technology is coming in, it's US listed, it's going to be clean, there's no risk of corruption, they'll bring in the technology, they were bringing customers, everything is all set. It takes 7 months to sign an advance pricing agreement. And apparently, that is the fastest they have ever done it. Now, it is, when this company meets someone in the direct taxes department and they are told the law of the land will prevail, it is not very reassuring. And so the pace at which we can give clarity, convenience to firms that we want to bring in capital and expertise, I think has to change. And therefore, it is not about just communication. There is a substance problem. So unless we change that, I think just working on the branding is not going to help.
No, it's the other way around. I mean, I think that, I think we've articulated what we want the India brand to be. And I think where the conversation now is, what does it mean to put our money where we want our mouths to be? So Manish has talked about, what the...
So on the state side, right? So I think the states, what I find very exciting is also that they are now competing with each other. So again, on this shoes thing, I was just visiting some shoe factories 2 weeks back, so it's very fresh in my mind. So there's this company which is actually at the TN Andhra border. And this company pays a courtesy call to some bureaucrat in TN and is told, and he said, okay, what are you up to? Oh, we are setting up a factory in Andhra, which is just across the border, from 30 kilometers away. I said, what? Why are you going to Andhra? He said, no, we can't find a 100-acre land parcel. Okay, where do you want it? Calls the DC, can we give them 100 acres of land? So I think the competition between states, when I was talking to Chhattisgarh, their industry secretary, I was amazed. His presentation had actually benchmarked what are the industrial subsidies that MP is providing, Jharkhand is providing. I was telling him that, look, fiscal subsidies are not going to help. You have to do ease of doing business. But the fact is that they are starting to benchmark, and I think the political messaging is also moving toward job creation, attracting FDI. Look at what UP is doing. So it is still, unfortunately, too sporadic. So even in UP, a foreign manufacturer would want to set up its factory near Jewar Airport, want to do it in Greater Noida. I mean, everyone is scared of going inland because they don't know when the law and order may again start deteriorating. So anyway, there are issues, but I think the state governments now need to sort of pick it up. And it's the same in China. It is absolutely the same in China. 4 provinces account for 80% of Chinese goods exports.
Could I just add that, and I'm going to say it carefully, that the biggest damage to the Indian brand is the regulatory cholesterol. And fixing regulatory cholesterol is now civil service reform. It's not the 6,700 IAS officers, it's the 25 million civil servants, because the steel frame is becoming a steel cage. Politics has become very competitive at a national level. States are competing, businesses are competing. We're recognizing that our equity is not on our balance sheet, our talent is it. We're investing more in R&D, we're investing more in brands, we're investing more in many things. But I think there are 3 mentalities in ease of doing business which are holding us back. One is prohibited till permitted.
Is what?
Prohibited till permitted. The other is I'm too big for small things and too small for big things. You know, you go to a bureaucrat with labor law, he'll say go to parliament. You go to him with something small, he'll say go to that club 1,000 miles away. So I don't know what they're doing there. And the third one is sort of drunk driving is an argument against cars. Right? You write the law for the thief rather, and instead of putting the drunk driver in jail, you ban cars on the road, right? So I think it really is, in my mind, I'm saying this again, that infrastructure, skills, finance, land, which used to be a dagger in the heart, now for foreign investors, and I think now we should stop distinguishing between foreign and Indian investors, right? If SEZs are a good idea, make the whole of India an SEZ. Why should they get, special reference? So I think the regulatory cholesterol may be the last economic thing. We don't live in a society, we don't live in an economy, we live in a society. And obviously we're focusing on economics because we already believe that India's soft power in movies, in culture, and everything else is very strong. We were weak because we were economically weak.
Before I open this up to the audience, let me just ask you to reflect on how tough it is for India to follow China in several senses, but the most important one is that, a development economist of my vintage grew up in an environment where, on the whole, the rise of the global south was considered a good thing for all kinds of things. Then China came along and really made a reality of development, and then developed FANGs, etc. And the issue now is, how do we create a stake for India's rise in the world, and how worried do we need to be about it, as it were? Are people, welcoming China +1, or are they concerned, oh my God, these guys are going to take away our jobs? How should that be part of the, as it were, branding strategy, not the branding agenda, but the branding strategy? How do we make our rise something that people welcome rather than are threatened by? Whoever wants to start.
I mean, the China-India comparison, our biggest ally is Xi Jinping. I hope he doesn't get a 4th term. I hope he gets a life term.
No.
No, I think that's important. I think that Deng Xiaoping did not succeed because of communism or autocracy. It succeeded because of leadership. He's a very wise man who said, cross the river by feeling the stones, hide your strength, bide your time. I don't care if a cat is black or white or it catches mice. I think India has digested the fixed costs of democracy. There are fixed costs of democracy. It would be churlish to deny them. But I think after 75, 80 years of democracy and after 31 years of economic reform, we have digested them. We have to isolate this problem to say, why do 63 million enterprises translate only to 27,000 companies with a paid-up capital of more than 10 crores? There is no cultural explanation. The Hindu rate of growth went from 2% to 7% without shooting all the Hindus. So clearly that was an inadequate explanation for culture. So Indians we don't have a cultural problem with economic growth or poverty or informality or corruption. There is a certain, you have to shift from the bird's eye view or the satellite view of employers to the worm's eye view of employers. Walk through the daily life, and it's not, the regulatory cholesterol doesn't matter to people like us. We have 150 guys in regulatory affairs whose single job is taking care of this cholesterol. But small companies can't do that. So we have the romance of small in politics, but we don't do what is needed. The regulatory cholesterol doesn't hurt big people, it hurts small ones. So I think the India-China brand is, already India is relatively shining. And life is a beauty contest. You don't have to be Milan Soman or Aishwarya Rai, you just have to be less ugly than your competitor.
Yeah, and
So you think the world is...
But see, I think from even today, you see some of the biggest pharma companies are setting up, and there are special cities being set up in China where, there are different patent laws, different laws for testing of drugs and all of that. They're investing heavily. Sanofi has very famously, decided to sort of separate out the China part because it thinks it's very valuable. So I don't think that the corporates, the multinationals, have really sworn away from China. I think they're just they're worried that at some point something drastic happens and therefore they're switching away. So I think the messaging and the reason why China's rise was supported was because there was self-interest. And so we have to think about where is the self-interest, and that is why the companies are comfortable. I think their self-interest is in doing all the GCCs here, because now you're getting all the talent. We've understood how to do the global travel. We have a large number of international airports. So we are starting to solve some of those problems. What perhaps we need to now start solving for is, as we send more and more of our workers abroad. So instead of $115 billion of remittance income, we get $300 billion of remittance income in the next 10 years, is that we start finding allies in people who find farm workers in Italy or nurses in the UK or plumbers in Japan, and start finding how we can build that brand so that the people there are not politically opposing it. And I think that's where, from an economic perspective, if we start to solve it, I don't see, India becoming really, in fact, just continuing with the way we are. When you think about a company deciding to invest in India instead of, say, Mexico, and saying, and this is a real world story, that, look, Mexico is always going to be aligned. This is a European company. That Mexico is always going to be aligned to the US. India, we expect, is going to be neutral throughout, right? So, and I think maintaining that strategic neutrality, there are many things that we can do, but it will be a while before the world starts getting threatened by us.
Are we set up for Q&A here or not? Yeah, I was going to take about 3 questions, but this format is a little awkward, but yeah.
First, ma'am, you can. The mic is there.
Good evening. Mrs. Sabhrawal, one thing always has confused me. Indians are constantly talking about the fact that the rest of the world has to find us democratic. Why did China never suffer from that problem? And how does that fit into our conversation today? China is nowhere near being a democracy, as we all know. Nobody ever expected it of them. So what is it that we can, as Indians, do over the next 10 years to come somewhere perhaps close to it, if not exactly the same, because we are different from China?
That's for you, Manish. Let's take one more from somewhere.
So please go ahead.
Yeah, people behind me who will not be neglected.
Hi,
This is Samira Bharadwaj. Question to you. Again, from the perspective of brand brings a lot of attention and a sense of belonging, and which is why we get to Brand Bharat, right? How are we looking at it both from a global perspective as well as from the internal perspective, where the brand also has another side of connotative negatives that are kind of hidden because of various different policies or regulatory affairs? How do we look at really enhancing that brand?
Here is one question, sir.
Yeah.
This side. Manish ji, question for you. How do you address the most important problem in India, which is the underemployment part? People say, unemployment is an issue, but underemployment is actually a bigger issue, if you ask me. What would you suggest as the mantra to solve that?
Okay, that's 3 questions. So Manish, 2 of them were for you. One is why is democracy an important part of the India brand? And the second, unemployment. And then I think the one here I'll take myself.
I think democracy is an important part of the India brand, and China, your implication is China didn't get hurt by the lack of democracy, is it? Is that question? Zhou Enlai was a premier of China. He was asked by Henry Kissinger in 1971 what was the impact of the French Revolution in 1789. Zhou Enlai said it's too early to tell, 150 years later. I think it's too early to tell whether the Chinese model of delivering mass prosperity without delivering mass democracy is sustainable. India's brand is be consistently warm rather than hot or cold. We'll never be 13% growth, but we'll never be 2%. We'll be 6, 7, 8. And, the magic of compounding, compounding is a wonderful, wonderful thing. I go to business schools all the time and I ask kids, will you take 10 lakhs right now or 1 paisa doubling a day for 31 days? Most people will take 10 lakhs, but it's 1 crore 6 lakhs, 1 paisa, 2 paisa, 4 paisa. But the catch in that is that till the 24th day, you're better off taking 10 lakhs. It's only in the last 6 days that you go from 10 lakhs to 1 crore 6 lakhs. And I think that is the promise of a democracy, that we will be consistently warm rather than hot or cold. We'll be less volatile. We'll be frustrating. We'll be difficult. But we'll be 6. If we're at 8% growth, don't worry, we're going to 6. And if we're at 6, don't worry, we're going back to 8. So,
and if I may add
that matters.
quickly, one of the reasons that the Western world now distrusts China is because of the significant concentration of power that Xi Jinping. So there are no democratic checks and there are no checks and balances on what he's doing. In India, that is very, very hard to imagine. And therefore, at any point of time, there will be open discussion. There will be, the foreign firms will have an ability to lobby. Because that's also very important. Them feeling that they have a voice, they have an influence. In China, they have currently no voice. And so that's why I think democracy makes you from the outside a lot more trustworthy.
Okay, we have a chance for a couple more questions on
Yes.
how you think of
So
underemployment.
India's problem is not unemployment, it's employed poverty, as you said, right? How do you solve employed poverty? I think we have done a big disservice to India by overselling fiscal and monetary policy. Fiscal deficits, if fiscal deficits could make countries rich, then no country would bother being poor. And I've spent a few years on the RBI board. I still haven't decided whether monetary policy is a painkiller or a placebo or a steroid, but it's not a medicine. The only way to fix underemployment is to raise the productivity of our states, our cities, our firms, our sectors, and our skills, right? States is obvious. My parents live in UP, I live in Karnataka. Both states have the same GDP. Karnataka does it with 1/5 the number of people, right? So it's clear. Cities is obvious. If everybody in India lived in Bangalore, India's GDP would be more than China, right? India's GDP is $2,500. Bangalore's GDP is $12,500. Sectors is quite obvious. 42% of our labor force in agriculture only generates 14% of GDP. So the only way to help farmers is to have less farmers. But how do you have less farmers, which is high productivity firms? We have 63 million enterprises, 12 million don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 12 million are registered for GST, only 8 million pay GST, only 1 million pay Provident Fund, and only 28,000 companies have paid up capital. So I think of all the ones, and skills, we've got a national education policy, but more importantly, we only need to do repair, as electronics in Foxconn is teaching us. We prepare and upgrade maybe longer term problems. So I would say the single most biggest intervention we can make to underemployment is higher productivity firms and manufacturing firms. We'll never, the peak of any country's labor force in manufacturing was Britain in World War II. It was 45%. America peaked at 38, China peaked at 28. We'll never get to 45, 33, or 28 because manufacturing has changed, but 11% is the wrong number. So if we have more high productivity firms and we have more manufacturing, underemployment will get reduced.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I got the question from here, but let me have a stab at it because then we need to close down. So I understood you to be asking, so how does one now build a brand? Was that the question? Could you kindly just articulate it one more time?
Sure. So Brand Bharat essentially is today one internal as well as external,
Yes.
right? I've lived abroad and I've seen the change how global markets are looking at us. Necessarily, it also brings a lot of negative attention for the brand, for the growth and aspects, and certainly the policies that are there, which are more constructive in nature. How do we navigate this in order to really bring about that Brand Bharat?
Well, I mean, I think we got some of the answer to that in the remarks of the two previous sessions. So, look, I mean, Brand Bharat should mean and could mean all the things that we were told about, cerebral, brainy, spiritual, So why do we not get the kind of kudos that Greece and Rome do while we've been around longer? So you, I think, are hinting that Bharat has negative associations with it. And I think what we've heard and what these next 2 days are going to be about is that we have to have the confidence in all these other dimensions. And that is part of building Brand Bharat. So I would just, in the last, to my watch, 3 minutes, ask each of you, any final thoughts, and I won't try and sum up, but I'll make a couple of points on what I think I've learned. You started, so Manish?
They're asking for a question.
Oh, is this, sorry?
Are you asking for a question?
So just a last question from Mr. Ramadhavji.
Oh, so I missed that.
So I just wanted to make a submission that political systems have nothing to do with economic prosperity. There are dictatorships which are very poor countries. There are democracies which are very prosperous countries. You take the European countries, you take America, they're democracies, they are very rich. There are dictatorships in our part of the world, they are very poor. So merely because China is not a democracy, that doesn't automatically qualify it to become a prosperous country. There is something more to it. That's why about this topic, I just ask one question. Those 15 years between 1985 and around 2000 when China entered WTO, that was the real base on which China took off after 2000. That 15 years, 10 to 15 years window. I will take you back by 60 years. It was 1933 to 1940-41 New Deal, 10 years, a decade, followed by a Second World War, allowed America to take off, not because it's a democracy, nor because it's a dictatorship. What is that 10 years for India? What is that New Deal for India? With MNCs leaving, foreign banks closing down, of course, still FDI coming in. What is that New Deal for India that can probably catapult it to developed economy, developed country, not democracy, not dictatorship?
So, I mean, I represent the National Institution for Transforming India, and your question to me is, what is going to transform India? Am I right? Okay. In the last minute of the conversation. So, I'll give you a framework, and then the question of what that actually means, not in terms of brand, but in terms of action. So, I think Manish already mentioned administrative reform. I think the challenge before us, Ramadhavji, is to fundamentally reshape three sets of relationships between the state and the citizen, okay, which PM has talked a lot about, essentially we have to serve the citizen. Ultimately this is about unleashing private initiative. And so we have to ask the question, he calls it regulatory connection, what holds back India's private initiative? So the answer is going to be domestic rather than, I think, largely international. And it's going to be sort of like the early universe, patchy. And we're already seeing it, as we've seen in Tamil Nadu and maybe in Bangalore, etc. And one way of, as he's put it, of reframing it is that if all India's states could, as it were, attain the top rank amongst India's states, that's a large part of the problem solved. But let me just come back to in the interest of time. So the relationship, most of all, between the state and the private sector. Arvind Subramanian talked of a stigmatized private sector, and you only have to see today's headlines. So the texture of the relationship between the political class and the private sector is toxic at the moment, and somehow we have to change that. And we have to change the whole, because lots of good things are happening, but they are all happening furtively. And so I don't think we can release all those animal spirits. Ned Phelps at Columbia had a book called Mass Flourishing, where he talked really about the great growth periods, somewhat different from your view, Ram Madhavji, as being about internal empowerment. And certainly, you know what PM's views as well as I do, but what he said at the Hindustan Times Conclave was that we have to give people the dignity, so we have to allow them to realize their talents and aspirations. So it is fundamentally an individual-driven rather than a state-driven. Now, what it takes to get there, I think, is a much larger issue, but I think looking back 10 years from now, if we've not made progress on those issues, then we will stay at 6%. If we make progress on those issues, I think we could get to 9 or 10%. Now, is that the Chinese story? I think that's a whole new session. But I think I'm 2 minutes over time, and let me thank the panelists, thank the audience, and again, thank the India Foundation for giving us the opportunity.